Not a single person in the grand ballroom looked up when Rowan Blake walked in wearing a dated suit and a hand-addressed invitation folded at the corner of his breast pocket. On the stage above, the powerful female CEO Vivian Ashford surveyed him from head to toe and spoke coolly into the microphone before hundreds of assembled guests. "He's just a nobody." Rowan did not answer. He only set a small wooden box on the honor table and waited. But the moment the lid came open, 100 decorated veterans rose in unison, standing at rigid attention and offering him a salute, and the color drained from Vivian's face all at once. Stay with this story until the very end, and you will understand why a man with no title earned the deepest respect of 100 heroes. The Ashford Veterans Legacy Gala was Richmond's most anticipated evening of the year, the kind of event that turned the lobby of the Ashford Grand into a cathedral of ambition and goodwill, where the two were never quite separable. Crystal chandeliers pushed warm light across the faces of defense contractors, city council members, retired senior officers, and the kind of donors whose names appeared on university buildings. The dress code was black tie, enforced without apology, and the atmosphere carried the particular electricity of people who understood they were being seen. Every table arrangement, every floral centerpiece, every carefully worded program insert was a signal about what Ashford Dominion Group wanted the world to believe about itself. The evening had been constructed as carefully as any architecture the company had ever commissioned, because the company's reputation needed renovation more urgently than any of its properties. Vivian Ashford was 38 years old and had been running a multi-billion empire since her father Harrison's death 6 years earlier, an empire built across real estate, hospitality, and defense contracting. She was intelligent, composed, and ruthlessly effective at managing public perception. The announcement she planned to deliver that evening, a $50 million Veterans Support Fund bearing the Ashford name, was designed to do exactly that. Transform the narrative about the company from one of inherited privilege to one of civic responsibility. Reporters from 3 regional outlets had been credentialed for the event. Vivian had approved every detail of the seating chart herself, which was why the commotion near the main entrance, shortly before 8 o'clock, irritated her the moment she heard about it. Rowan Blake arrived without a driver, without an escort, and without the kind of quiet authority that Richmond's powerful tended to wear as a second skin. He was 42 years old, with the steady bearing of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy on rooms that had already made up their minds about him. His suit was dark navy, well fitted once but not recently, and the invitation he handed to the security staff at the entrance had been written in longhand on cream stationery, not the embossed electronic entry passes the venue had distributed through Ashford's events office. The young man scanning credentials ran the name twice before confirming it did not appear on the master list. A second staff member was summoned, then a third. Rowan stood through all of it without complaint, his hands loose at his sides, his expression suggesting he had waded through worse. He made only one request, that he be permitted to deliver a small wooden box to the host before he left, and that if someone would inform General Tobias Rourke he was here, the situation would resolve itself quickly. What Rowan did not know was that his name had been deliberately removed from the guest list 4 days earlier. The order had come from Alistair Ashford's office without explanation and had been routed through the events coordinator in language that sounded administrative rather than purposeful. Alistair Ashford, 64 years old and chairman of the board, had served the company since before Vivian was born and had managed the transition of power after Harrison's death with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for it for years. He was not a man who left accidents in his wake. He had also ensured that General Rourke was occupied in a private meeting on the hotel's upper floors at the time Rowan was expected to arrive, and that the 100 veterans seated at the rear tables near the ballroom's east wall, had no way of knowing that the one man they would have stood to greet was currently standing at the service entrance, arguing with a 23-year-old event staffer about a handwritten invitation. Vivian saw the gathering tension near the door from the corner of the stage and read it correctly as a threat to the broadcast feed. She descended the steps in a floor-length gown and crossed the lobby in the particular way she had perfected over years of managing crises, quickly enough to signal authority, slowly enough to avoid appearing rattled. She asked what was happening. A staff member told her a man without a proper invitation was claiming to have been personally invited by General Rourke and was refusing to leave without delivering a package to the host. Vivian looked at Rowan. He looked back at her without deference or aggression, which was in its own way more disorienting than either. He told her he was there to return something that belonged to the Ashford family, something her father had entrusted to him for safekeeping. Vivian's immediate assessment was that she was looking at someone who had rehearsed this moment, someone angling for a camera frame or a leveraged introduction. She had encountered this category of person before at charity functions. Not dangerous, but inconvenient. She was about to ask security to escort him out when Rowan looked past her, up at the large oil portrait of Harrison Ashford mounted above the lobby's east staircase, and said quietly, almost to himself, "Your father once told me this place would never profit from betraying the people who wore the uniform." The sentence landed in a way Vivian had not expected. It was not a threat. It was not a negotiating opener. It was a sentence that her father had spoken to her only once, in private, 3 weeks before he died, and which she had never repeated to anyone. The gala's program was running. 1,200 guests were seated. 3 cameras were live. And Vivian Ashford stood in the lobby of her family's most visible property, looking at a man in a dated suit who had just spoken her father's private words back to her with the casual accuracy of someone retrieving something from memory rather than performance. She told security to stand down and asked Rowan to follow her to the main floor, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty she felt. Whatever this was, she intended to manage it in the open, not in a stairwell. That was the first miscalculation of the evening, and it belonged entirely to her. The return to the ballroom floor drew attention that Vivienne had not planned for. A photojournalist working the event recognized the body language of an unscripted moment and repositioned. Several guests near the entrance began the low murmur that spreads through any crowd when something is unfolding outside the program. Vivian was acutely aware of the cameras and equally aware that the man beside her looked nothing like the evening's intended cast of honor. No medals on his lapel, no aide nearby, no recognizable rank or credential visible to anyone in the room. He was, by every external measure available to the people now watching, exactly what he appeared to be, a man who did not belong in this space. Alistair materialized at Vivian's elbow with the timing of someone who had been watching from a calculated distance. His expression was the practiced blend of concern and authority he deployed in board meetings when things were not going according to plan, which was whenever things were going according to someone else's plan. He told Vivian, in a voice just low enough to suggest discretion and just audible enough to reach the nearest table, that the man she had escorted inside was the maintenance supervisor at the Hawthorne Recovery Center, a property currently in active dispute with Ashford Dominion over a pending land acquisition. He suggested, with a measured reasonableness that was his most reliable weapon, that this man had likely come to disrupt the gala as leverage in the dispute, using the occasion and the cameras to manufacture sympathy. It was, Alistair said, the kind of tactic that certain advocacy groups had used against corporate events before. He looked at Vivian with the expression of a man who regretted having to say what he was saying. Vivian processed this in seconds. The land dispute was real. Ashford Dominion had initiated proceedings to acquire the Hawthorne property for a resort development. She had approved the filing. If this man was here in connection with that dispute, then everything she had assumed about his motives suddenly had an architecture behind it. She turned to him and said, in a tone meant to close the matter with minimum damage to the evening's momentum, that she understood his position, but that the gala was not the appropriate venue for a business dispute. She directed him to the side of the room with the particular authority of someone who has decided the conversation is over. Rowan did not move with urgency. He asked her, in a voice calibrated for the two of them rather than the surrounding tables, whether she had ever read the full text of her father's original estate documents. Not the summary her lawyers had prepared, but the unabridged filing. The question hit at an angle she was not ready for. Vivian had taken control of the company through a transition process managed almost entirely by Alistair and the legal team Harrison had built during his lifetime. She had reviewed summaries, approved frameworks, signed documents. She had not read every page of every filing. No one who ran a company of that size did. She told him that all documents had been reviewed by qualified counsel. Rowan nodded, as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected rather than resolved anything. A donor at a nearby table made a remark about the suit, loud enough to be heard by 4 or 5 people seated close by, and a small ripple of agreement moved through the cluster. The tone of the room had shifted in the way rooms shift when a collective permission is given to be unkind. Someone else noted that maintenance workers didn't typically attend black-tie fundraisers. The laughter that followed was polite and cutting in equal measure. Vivian did not join it, but she did not stop it. She had already reached for the microphone. What she said into it was brief and intended to move the evening forward. She noted that the gala existed to recognize genuine service and sacrifice, not to provide a platform for those who wished to exploit the generosity of others. When a junior staff member standing nearby asked who the man was, Vivian answered without pausing, "He's just a nobody." The words left the microphone before she had thought about them as words at all. They were administrative, in her mind, the verbal equivalent of a door being closed. But a door closing in a silent room makes a sound, and the ballroom went quiet enough for that sound to carry. Rowan did not respond. He looked out at the rows of tables where decorated veterans sat in formal attire, men and women who had come to this event as guests of honor, wearing ribbons and medals that represented what they had surrendered to earn them. He did not introduce himself to any of them. He did not make a speech or a gesture. He walked to the honor table at the front of the room, set the wooden box on the white linen with both hands, and stood back. Alistair had followed him from a careful distance, and when the box touched the table, he moved close enough to see the symbol carved into the lid, a lantern with its flame oriented downward, surrounded by a circle of 8 points. His face did not move, but the color in it changed. The symbol meant something specific to a very small number of people, and every one of them was in this room. The main doors at the rear of the ballroom opened, and General Tobias Rourke walked in. He was 67 years old, 4-star, retired, and built like someone who had earned every inch of his bearing over decades of decisions that cost people something. He had been in a meeting upstairs that had ended earlier than Alistair had arranged for it to. He crossed the threshold and saw Rowan Blake standing at the front of the room. The general stopped where he was, in the middle of the center aisle, and raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. The room did not immediately understand what it was watching. The veterans seated at the rear tables saw it first. One man near the east wall pushed his chair back and stood, then the man beside him. Then, in the way that certainty moves through a body of people who share a common language, every veteran in that room rose to their feet. 100 men and women, some carrying canes, some with medals enough to cover the left side of their jackets, all facing the same direction, all performing the same gesture. There was no musical cue, no announcement, no coordinator with a headset. It was entirely voluntary, and it was entirely unanimous. The sound of 100 chairs moving across a marble floor in near unison was the only sound in the room. Vivian did not move from the stage. She watched the ballroom she had planned and funded and populated with Richmond's most credentialed citizens reorganize itself around a man she had just told the room was nobody, and she had no framework for what she was seeing. The donors, the contractors, the politicians, and the journalist who had come to document her generosity were watching the people she had gathered to celebrate refuse, implicitly and without a word, the premise of the evening's most recent announcement. Rowan stood straight and returned the salute for a measured count before lowering his hand and asking, simply and without ceremony, that everyone please sit down. General Rourke reached the front of the room and addressed Rowan by his rank, Captain Blake. He spoke loud enough for the nearest tables to hear him and made no effort to moderate his volume for the cameras. A veteran who had served directly under Rowan at a forward operating base 14 years earlier said, from his table, that the man standing at the front was the reason half the people in that room had come home at all. Several others nodded or spoke low words of agreement that moved through the seated rows like water finding its level. Vivian, still on the stage, heard all of it. She asked General Rourke why the name Rowan Blake appeared in none of the medal citations she had ever reviewed in connection with the gala's honorees. The general's answer was short. He said there were men who accepted recognition in front of cameras, and there were men who declined it to protect the people they had served with. He said both kinds existed, and the second kind was generally harder to find. Alistair stepped forward at this point and said, in his most reasoned board meeting voice, that whatever Captain Blake may have done in uniform was entirely separate from the business dispute currently before the company's legal team, and that conflating the two was not in anyone's interest. Rowan agreed that it was separate. He said he had not come for recognition. He had come because the Hawthorne Recovery Center was scheduled to lose its operating grounds in 14 days, and because the 212 veterans currently using its rehabilitation and employment programs would have no equivalent facility within 100 miles. He said this plainly, without accusation, the way someone states a logistical fact. Vivian said the acquisition had been reviewed and approved through the proper governance channels. She said it again when Rowan did not respond, because his silence made the sentence feel less true the second time. He opened the wooden box. Inside, there was no medal. There was no citation or certificate or anything that resembled an award. There was a small brass key, a sealed letter with a wax impression, and a data storage device no larger than a thumb drive, its casing old enough to suggest it had been made before Vivienne had taken control of the company. Evelyn Rourke, who had been seated near the east wall and who had not been introduced to the room, stood and moved to the front. She was 61 years old, a trust and estates attorney who specialized in veterans' legal affairs, and she was the younger sister of a man whose name appeared on the Hawthorne Center's founding plaque. She looked at the contents of the box for several seconds before she spoke. She said that if the documents inside were authentic, Vivian did not have the authority to sell the Hawthorne property. She said, more quietly, that Vivian might not have clear authority over the company at all. 14 years earlier, Rowan Blake held the rank of captain and was responsible for logistics and evacuation in a classified theater operation designated Operation Lantern. The mission had been described in its planning documents as a material and personnel transfer, extraction of equipment and non-combat staff from an area of increasing instability. It was not supposed to become a rescue operation. The intelligence assessment that had informed its design was wrong about the timeline, and the communication infrastructure that was supposed to connect the extraction teams had failed at the worst possible moment. Units that were supposed to be out within 8 hours were still on the ground when the primary exit corridor began to close. The formal orders that reached Rowan's command post were unambiguous. His team was to complete their assigned extraction and withdraw before the corridor was lost. The orders did not account for the 117 military personnel and humanitarian workers who had not yet reached the staging point, because the comms failure had broken the relay chain. Rowan's team had vehicles, fuel, and a functioning radio on a secondary frequency. Rowan had a set of standing orders and a choice. He chose the people. He did not consult higher command. He did not file an amended mission report before acting. He reorganized his vehicles into 4 separate moving columns, created diversionary routes using local geographic knowledge, repaired 2 vehicles that had been flagged as non-operational, and coordinated with a regional militia through a translator who had been scheduled to leave on the first convoy. Over the course of 47 hours without a full rest cycle, he moved every one of those 117 people to safety. On the final run, a medevac helicopter arrived with 1 seat more than Rowan had anticipated. There was a sergeant with a compound fracture who had been moved to the last vehicle because he could not walk unassisted. Rowan put him on the helicopter and sent it out. He drove back on a secondary road with 2 other men in a vehicle that ran on a fuel mixture they had assembled from 5 different containers. All 3 of them made it out. The operation had lasted 2 days longer than any sanctioned timeline, had used resources that were not assigned to Rowan's command, and had succeeded entirely because the man running it understood that the difference between a rule and a principle is what you do when following the rule means abandoning the principle. The men and women he brought back understood this, even if the after-action report was written by people who had not been there and did not want to be made to feel they should have. When the operations after-action report was assembled, it noted that Captain Blake had deviated from the approved withdrawal order and had commandeered military vehicles and resources without authorization. It recommended an investigation. What the report did not note, because the investigation was conducted by a review board that had been quietly shaped by the company, whose equipment had caused the comms failure in the first place, was that the equipment failure was not random. A subcontractor responsible for the field communication units had delivered a batch of hardware that had failed pre-deployment testing and been approved for field use anyway. The approval had come from a procurement manager whose contract relationship traced back, through 2 intermediate companies, to Ashford Dominion's defense subsidiary. Harrison Ashford had learned this in the weeks after the operation, during a quiet audit he had initiated after a whistleblower in his own company sent a document to his personal address. He did not go to the press. He did not immediately go to the government. He asked Rowan Blake, whom he tracked down through a retired colonel he trusted, to meet him. At that meeting, Harrison Ashford told Rowan the truth about the equipment failure and offered him a settlement, a public acknowledgement, and a formal apology. Rowan declined the settlement and the public acknowledgement. He accepted the apology. Then he told Harrison what he wanted: a funded recovery center for veterans affected by the operation, protected by a legal structure that would prevent it from being altered or defunded without the consent of an independent board. He wanted it operational within 2 years, and he wanted its funding guaranteed for a minimum of 25 years. He asked for nothing for himself. Harrison agreed. The Hawthorne Recovery Center opened 18 months later on land that Ashford Dominion held in perpetual charitable trust. Before Harrison died, he placed a sealed document in a wooden box with a brass key and handed it to Rowan in a meeting that Alistair Ashford had also attended. The box was only to be opened if the Ashford family moved to dissolve or alienate the trust. General Rourke let the room absorb this before he spoke again. He said that when he used the phrase, The Ashford family. He wanted to be precise about which member of that family had been in the room when Harrison gave Rowan the box. He looked at Alistair. He said that Alistair Ashford had been present at the agreement, had known the terms for every year since, and had spent the last 3 years routing the center's operating fund through a cascade of consulting contracts that had reduced its actual support capacity by 61%, while the announced donation figures continued to grow. The color in Alistair's face did not change noticeably, because he had spent 60 years learning not to let rooms read him. He said the general was repeating allegations that had no legal standing. He said the box's contents could have been altered over the course of 14 years. He said that Rowan Blake had been formally investigated after Operation Lantern, that the investigation had not been resolved in his favor, and that the room was being asked to extend trust to a man whose record contained a documented incident of insubordination. The framing was exact and deliberate. He was not accusing Rowan of lying. He was placing a shadow over the story and letting the room decide whether to stand in it. Vivienne was still processing. She had known about the land dispute. She had not known about Harrison's private meeting with a veteran. She had not known about any arrangement that predated her assumption of control. She began to ask Alistair questions she had not thought to ask before, and as she did, she recognized that her not asking them had not been an accident. It had been managed. She had never seen the original handwritten version of her father's estate documents, only the reformatted legal summary her team had prepared. Every report about Hawthorne had come through Alistair's office. The center's financial summaries showed reduced activity, but she had been told the reduction reflected lower demand, not funding diversion. The development project that had prompted the land acquisition was registered to a holding company she did not recognize, one whose principal address was a registered agent's office in Delaware. Evelyn had been listening and had been making notes in a small leather-bound pad throughout. She said the letter in the box bore Harrison Ashford's signature and a notary's seal from a firm she could verify independently. She said the data device appeared to contain document archives. She said she needed time and proper equipment to confirm the legal standing of the materials, but that if they were what she believed them to be, the charitable trust instrument gave Rowan Blake, as named custodian, the right to activate a provision converting a specified block of the Ashford family's voting shares to the Lantern Veterans Trust, a nonprofit board whose membership was defined in the original filing and included no member of the Ashford family. The vote needed to dissolve or sell a protected asset had been triggered. The provision was now in effect. Alistair spoke without pause. He said Rowan was orchestrating a hostile takeover using fabricated sentiment and a forged document. He said the room was watching a coordinated effort to use veterans as instruments of corporate extortion. He said it loudly, and he said it with the confidence of a man who had survived 60 years of boardrooms by making doubt work for him. Several guests shifted in their seats. A few donors exchanged glances. Rowan watched all of it and did not respond with anger. He said that the documents were available for independent verification and that he would accept whatever finding a qualified review produced. He asked Evelyn to hold the materials securely and surrendered the key to her in front of the room. Vivienne's mind was working through implications at the speed that had made her effective and that was now working against the composure she needed. She had signed the acquisition documents. That was not a question. It was a fact. She had signed them as part of a broader restructuring package that Alistair had assembled and that she had reviewed at the summary level. She had trusted that what her uncle presented to her was complete and accurate, because in 6 years of working together, he had never given her an explicit reason not to, and because she had been busy running a company and had chosen efficiency over diligence in a decision she now understood would define her in ways she could not yet measure. A photojournalist stationed near the stage had been recording audio since the moment the veterans stood. A reporter from a regional outlet had moved to the side of the room and was typing. The room was no longer a gala. It was a scene, and scenes required resolution. Alistair moved toward the edge of the ballroom in the direction of the main exit. He had the particular walk of a man who intended to be somewhere else before this room decided what it thought of him. The veterans seated near the exit did not move aggressively. Rowan had not asked them to, and they were people who understood the difference between presence and threat. But their collective stillness made the path to the door feel less navigable than it had. Rowan said, calmly and loud enough to be heard, that he wanted nothing that followed to be resolved by force or intimidation. He said, whatever happened next should be handled through proper legal channels, and that the materials in Evelyn's custody would be filed with the appropriate oversight bodies before the evening was over. Vivienne returned to the stage. She had not planned to go back up there. The program had dissolved. The announcement she had prepared about the $50 million fund felt, from where she was standing, like something from a different evening. She picked up the microphone, and without referring to notes or consulting anyone, she stated that all transactions related to the Hawthorne property were immediately frozen pending a full independent review. She said the review would be conducted by parties with no affiliation to Ashford Dominion. She said the gala's scheduled programming would not continue. She did not apologize for the disruption. She simply stated what was going to happen and set the microphone down. Alistair turned from the exit and told her that the board would convene an emergency vote to remove her from the CEO position before morning. He said it in front of the room as a warning and as a fact he believed to be within his control. Vivienne nodded once, as though she had already considered this and had decided it was acceptable collateral. Her composure in that moment was genuine in a way it had not been earlier in the evening, because it was no longer in service of an image. It was just what she had decided to do. The emergency board session convened at 11:17 in a private conference room on the hotel's 4th floor. It was not a long meeting. Alistair had prepared his proxies carefully and had the votes to remove Vivienne from the executive seat on a preliminary count. What he had not accounted for was Evelyn Rourke filing a formal legal notice to the company's registered agent at 11:22, citing the activation clause in the Lantern Veterans Trust instrument. The clause did not require board approval. It did not require a shareholder vote. It had been written by Harrison Ashford's personal attorney in the months after his meeting with Rowan, and it was designed specifically to function when the board could not be trusted to honor the trust's terms. The block of voting shares converted from family control to the trust's custody the moment the filing was registered. Alistair's proxies did not cover the new arithmetic. Vivienne was not restored to full authority. The reconstituted board made clear that she had signed documents without adequate diligence and had allowed significant financial mismanagement to proceed under her leadership, regardless of whether it had been engineered without her knowledge. That mattered. A CEO could not accept credit for a company's successes while directing accountability elsewhere when decisions went wrong. The failure was not that she had been deceived. It was that she had constructed a working environment in which deception of that scale had been possible, had been sustainable for years, and had been dressed up in the language of governance and efficiency until it became invisible. Vivienne said, at the board table, that she understood this and did not contest it. She agreed to a supervised leadership arrangement with a 3-person oversight committee. She offered to reduce her compensation to a symbolic figure for the calendar year, and to contribute personal assets to an emergency fund for Hawthorne's operational continuity. She said none of this was bargaining. It was what she believed she owed. Rowan had been named as temporary custodian of the trust's voting shares, a designation that gave him, for a period of 30 days, more effective power over Ashford Dominion than anyone in that hotel had imagined possible when the evening began. He transferred the voting rights to a 5-person board within 72 hours. 1 representative from the Hawthorne Center's resident population, 1 retired general officer, 1 veterans employment specialist, 1 independent financial auditor, and Evelyn Rourke in her capacity as trust counsel. He did not retain a seat for himself. He did not ask for a seat. He went back to work at the Hawthorne Center the following Monday. The investigation took several months and confirmed what the documents in the wooden box had indicated. Alistair Ashford had diverted a cumulative total of several $1,000,000 from the Hawthorne Operating Fund through a network of consulting agreements and service contracts connected to companies he controlled indirectly. He had drafted the land acquisition proposal with the explicit intention of purchasing the Hawthorne property at below market value through a holding company and converting it to a private resort development. He had used his access to the company's legal infrastructure to ensure that Vivienne's copy of Harrison's estate filing was a redacted version that omitted the Lantern Trust provision entirely. He had known about the provision since the day his brother told him about it, and he had spent 6 years waiting for the right opportunity to neutralize it before it could be used. The deletion of data from the Hawthorne Center's servers happened on the same night as the gala, while Vivienne was standing at a microphone in front of hundreds of witnesses. A cybersecurity consultant who had served under Rowan's command traced the deletion to a cloned credential generated months earlier by the company's senior legal officer, a man who had reported to Alistair since before Harrison's death. The Hawthorne data itself had not been permanently lost. Rowan had arranged for offline backups of the center's operational records after he noticed, 3 months earlier, that scheduled funding transfers were arriving late and in reduced amounts. He had not told anyone about the backups because he had not yet understood the full shape of what he suspected, and he had learned a long time ago that information disclosed before it was needed had a way of disappearing. Vivienne came to Rowan before the board's formal resolution was announced. She found him in the Hawthorne Center's workshop, where he was repairing a piece of exercise equipment with the same focused attention he would have given to anything else that needed fixing. She stood in the doorway until he looked up. She said she had been wrong about him, and wrong in the way she had said it, and wrong to have said it where she did. She did not ask him to forgive her. She said she was aware that an apology had a specific weight, and that it only held that weight if the person offering it was willing to bear consequences rather than just words. Rowan set down the wrench he was holding and looked at her for a moment without speaking. He said that respect did not begin when a whole room stood for someone. He said it began when a person did what was right while standing alone, and that this was the only test that had ever mattered. She asked him whether he would consider accepting a formal seat on the restructured board, in an advisory capacity. Rowan looked past her at the main corridor of the center, where a veteran who had arrived 3 weeks earlier was working with a physical therapist on the parallel bars, with the concentration of someone who had decided to come back from something. He said he would think about it. The formal reinstatement ceremony for Operation Lantern's acknowledgement was held 4 months later on a dry Saturday morning at the Hawthorne Center's central courtyard. It was not a large event. General Rourke had wanted something proportional to the occasion, which meant he had wanted something that reflected what Rowan himself would have wanted, which meant it was attended by the people who had been there rather than the people who had decided it mattered only recently. The full roster of the Operation Lantern support teams was read aloud. Each name received a moment of silence and a notation on a memorial plaque that would be mounted in the center's main hall. Rowan's name was the last one read. Mara Blake was 16, and had known her father had served, and had known he did not talk about it, which she had always understood was not the same thing as not wanting to. She had grown up watching him fix things, vehicles, equipment, a neighbor's fence after a storm, with the quiet competence of someone who had learned that most problems could be solved if you were willing to work through them without needing anyone to watch. She stood next to him in the courtyard and watched the people who had survived something with him come forward one by one to say, with whatever particular combination of words each person had available, what it meant that he had been there. She did not fully understand the details. She understood enough. When the ceremony concluded and the assembled veterans prepared to honor Rowan in the way that had now become something people outside the room had read about, he smiled. Not the managed expression of someone accepting recognition, but the quieter thing that appears when a person is genuinely moved and chooses not to perform something more composed over it. He raised one hand and asked them to stay in their seats. He said that on the day of the operation, they had stood for him to protect his name, and he would always carry that. He said that today, sitting together to build something permanent was the better way to mark the occasion. Vivienne was there. She sat in the second row, between a retired logistics sergeant and a woman who ran the center's employment placement program, and she did not position herself near the podium or near the cameras that a few journalists had been permitted to bring. She had accepted the conditions of her supervised leadership arrangement without negotiation and had spent the month since then working in ways that produced less visibility than anything she had done before. She watched Rowan Blake speak to the people who had assembled not because they had been told to, but because they had chosen to, and she understood something she had not understood the night she stood on a stage and dismissed him. The most powerful person in any room is not always the one holding the microphone. The announcements that followed the ceremony were not about any single person. They outlined a 10-year employment initiative, a housing partnership with 3 regional nonprofits, and an expanded mental health support program that would serve veterans in 5 surrounding counties. The funding had been secured. The governance structure had been established. The legal protections were permanent. What Harrison Ashford had promised in a private meeting 14 years ago had survived everything that had been arranged to prevent it. The man who had held that promise through 14 years of silence, ordinary work, and a single evening at a ballroom where a room full of powerful people had decided, briefly, that he was nobody. That man sat down in the front row of his own ceremony, between General Rourke and his daughter, and let the work speak for him. The most powerful person in the room is not always the one standing at the podium. Sometimes, it is the one whose silence made 100 heroes rise.